Let's rock and roll. Let's talk Telltale Heart. Telltale Heart is a story, and let's do it. You tell me a one-sentence summary of the Telltale Heart. I only want one sentence. I want you to put it in the chat. I want a one-sentence summary of the Telltale Heart. Type it in. There's a very easy and basic answer here. If you typed it, you would be correct. And I want to talk about that answer. I guess there's really no right. Yeah, there is a wrong answer. You couldn't say aliens came down and abducted somebody, because that would not be true. There you go. That is a fantastic answer. One person kills another person. That is it. Now, here's the deal. If you answered that, you would be correct. Technically, you'd be correct. However, this is the horror genre. And if you answer that way, you miss the entire intricacy. You miss the detail. You miss the artistry of the horror genre. If that's the only answer you know, if that's the only answer you're satisfied with, then you're missing so much. It'd be like saying the Mona Lisa, well, it's just a painting of a girl. Although you would be correct, you're missing the texture, the brush strokes. You're missing the smile. So many things that you're missing by just stating the obvious. So here in 8th grade, we like to go deep. And you are going to find that this story is a little bit different than maybe some of the other stories that you've had. So today we're going to talk about, a little bit about those intricacies. We're going to talk a little bit about the detail that is found within that story. And I'll start with the idea of suspense, because that is something that we looked at early on when talking about the overall horror genre. It creates suspense. Is there any time in the story that you can recall, and maybe I have, it may be tough. And if you don't know this answer, it's because you don't have total recall, and that's okay. Is there any time that you can think of in the story that you were recognizing that the author was trying to build suspense? If you can, yep. Is there any time that you can remember? Put in the chat, any time that you could remember. I might be able to get away with initials. I might be able to do that. Yeah. Yep, AW says, when the heartbeat is playing in the man's ear. That would definitely be one. Why is that coming up? What is it doing? Yes. CS says, when the man is standing by the door, 100%. If you'll recall, he spends either one or like 3 hours moving his head 12 inches into the door. The door is open, and he spends like an entire hour getting his head inside the door, and then he takes his thumb and it slips on the tin latch on the lantern. And the old man sits up, says, who's there? And he doesn't move a muscle. That idea of bringing you to that point is the idea of suspense. So CS, that is a great answer. There are a couple other opportunities for suspense. And if you'll recall, he does this. Edgar Allan Poe is the author. The narrator is someone totally different. I wish I would have made that distinction earlier. I apologize for that. The narrator is not Edgar Allan Poe, and maybe Miss Thompson made this point. But when we talk about who killed the old man, it's not Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is not a murderer. He's just someone telling the story and telling it from the narrator's point of view. So the narrator actually does something that sort of builds suspense, and he repeats himself. Remember when AW mentioned the heartbeat playing. And if you recall, towards the end of the story, actually all through the story, louder. That was the Christopher Lee version, but he keeps saying louder. That idea of repetition is very important when trying to build something. So keep that in mind. when we talk about how does the author build suspense, whether it's this story or any story moving forward, keep in mind, how can the author build suspense on text? Like in a movie, you can add sounds, you can add visuals, you can show the facial expressions, but in print, in a story, that's where Poe's artistry and his mastery of the art really shine through. And one more thing I sort of forgot to mention was, remember, this is sort of the first of its kind. He was one of the first ones to break through with this style. And as I thought about that, I tried to think about someone in the music industry who came about with something that people maybe haven't heard before. And I think about Sugar Hill Gang, like no one had really heard rap before. So when the Sugar Hill Gang came out with Rapper's Delight, people were like, what is this? What is this? This is a different form of music. Like people had heard the blues. People had heard rock and roll. Well, when Elvis came out, they hadn't heard it mainstream like rock and roll had been heard. But for the most part, they had heard those things. But when Sugar Hill Gang came out, rap was like, what is this new form of music? And I wish I could categorize someone like the Beastie Boys. Like in my mind, I don't remember hearing anything like that. And that was so funky. But when Poe came out with this style of writing, it was totally something different. So keep that in mind when all this is going on, in this idea of, this isn't that really that telling of a story, Mr. Neiman. This isn't that big of a deal. Well, it was a big deal because it was sort of the first of its kind. And that idea of suspense was in text was something different. So keep that in mind. The other question I was going to ask is, and this is a very hard one. This is incredibly hard. Last year, you guys read a story called The Outsiders. And The Outsiders was about Ponyboy. It was about Daryl. It was about all these characters. Cherry, whose real name was Sherry, but because she had red hair, you called her Sherry. So hopefully I'm jogging your memory about The Outsiders. And it was obvious about the exposition phase about a plot diagram. It was obvious that we were being told about each and every character, and that was sort of building our ability to understand who was who, and that's what's called the exposition phase. Does anybody have any idea what the exposition phase would be in this story? Which in this case is going to be very difficult because you don't have the story in front of you, and we haven't really spent 1,000 hours on the story. But maybe in the chat, just answer what would be the exposition phase, if you could. Remember, the exposition phase is when you're learning as the reader what sort of is the setting, who are the characters of that story. So what is the exposition phase here? And again, maybe you know, maybe you don't know.
You guys can pull it up on your screen, and if you're on a Chromebook, you can split the screen.
That is true. 100%. And if you don't know, actually communicate, Mr. Neiman, I have no idea. And which is totally fine with me. Because if you don't know, I want to tell you. And I also want to pull it up, and I can screen share, I suppose. I mean, I do know how to screen share. I do know how to do that. Actually, I should have gone Google Drive, but I might be able to find it in here. There, that's Telltale Heart. Boom. I'm going to share my screen. And I want you to, when I share this screen, I want you to look at this. Here we go. So I'm sharing this screen right here, and I'm blowing it up a little more. And I'm going to state that the exposition phase is actually line 8, basically 8 through what looks to be 16. Okay? It says, it is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. So now we're learning what is driving the narrator to this point of madness. It was the eye. Yes, it was. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye, with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up in my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Right there, we have the entire sort of groundwork or foundation as the reader for what the rest of the story is going to be about. If we ever had a question of what's going on in this story, we could go back to that paragraph starting in line 8 and read it and get our bearings back about us. And we could say, yes, this reminds me of why we're going through this journey. This is why. Because we're getting this kind of information, because it's laying the foundation the way it is, this is why this would be considered the exposition phase. Now, with that in mind, let me pull up my chat. And now, with that in mind, exposition, I want somebody to tell me what the next phase in the plot diagram is. If exposition is first, what is the next phase of a plot diagram? Does anybody know what the next phase? So there's 5 phases altogether of a plot diagram, basically how a story goes. And the first one is exposition. And then the next one, doesn't remember. Does anybody remember? I'll give you one hint. Starts with an R. It's 2 words. R-A. See if anybody recognizes this, and I'll type it in here. Everyone in the meeting. What about this? Does this look familiar? Now everybody can, in the chat, say, oh yeah, that's right. So let me type these out. Yes, good W. AAW remembers. Yes, Sid, SW remembers. CS remembers. CW remembers. Okay, so I wrote these out. Exposition, rising action. And let's see if you can get this one, BR. Let's see if you can get this one. After rising action, what would come next? So if you have exposition phase first, the foundation of what we're doing, rising action, what would be the next on the plot graph? The very middle section. Does anybody remember that? Yes, exactly right, AW. Great job. 100% great job. And I want to just copy and paste this real quick. Here we go. Copy, paste. Here we go. Yes, great job, BR. So next up is climax. So now that we have these 3 pieces, we can look at the exposition phase as lines 8 through, let's say 16 there. Lines 8 through 16 is the foundation for what we read. If we ever get lost in what we're reading, we can come back to lines 8 through 16 and say, yes, that is the foundation for what we were doing. That is the exposition phase. But as we move, rising action. Can somebody tell me one situation in the story that would be considered rising action? Remember, rising action is the action that leads to the climax. And if you can't, that's okay, because then we'll just skip forward and go to what you think is the climax, and then we can work back from there. That's sort of the easiest way to do it, actually. So you can either tell me RA and then tell me what the RA is, or the C, the climax, and tell me what the climax is. I don't mind either way, to be honest with you. But I wrestled with what is the climax. I did wrestle with it. What do you think was the rising action or even the climax of this? RA, the man standing at the door. I believe I would agree with you 100% there. I would agree that the rising action is the man standing at the door when he takes him, it takes him like an hour to get his head just 12 inches through the door. I believe that is all rising action. I believe that's a great job. So, the man sitting up in his bed. I believe that is also rising action. So let's do this. I believe that the climax, and I even sent Ms. Thompson a message about this. I talked to my other teachers about this. I believe the climax of this story, and I know this sounds weird, is when he confesses to the murder. At the very end of the story, that is the climax. So that's when everything sort of unravels. The exposition phase is met. If you'll recall, in the exposition phase, he says he wants to kill the man. He finally kills the man. But then the most dramatic part, the part that is like, oh, what just happened? He confesses to the murder. So I'm going to scroll, and if you're still sharing with the screen, I'm going to scroll all the way to the end, and I'm actually going to read sort of 170 to 194. It sort of brings us through that climax. So all that leads up to the last paragraph, which is those last 3 lines, this is the rising action, the real big. Now, before we had some rising action, but it sort of dipped and then it came back up. So the rising action says, no doubt I grew very pale. This is all rising action. But I talked more fluently, with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. And that sound is that beating heart. What could I do? It was so low, dull, quick sound, much like a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. The noise again of the beating heart. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key with the violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited by observation of men. But the noise steadily increased. What could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over it all and it continually increased. So even though he's trying to make this noise with his steps and the chair, the sound of the beating heart is still there. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? No, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark, louder, louder, louder. So this is all building. I can't take it anymore. And he says finally, villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed, tear up the planks, here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. So in this case, the climax is when he admits to what happened. The rising action not only is when he kills the old man, but also it comes back in the form of his confession. So if I copy, this is why it's a little tricky for you 8th graders now. We now have to resolve, check out the chat real quick. Check out the chat. We've talked about the exposition phase. We've talked about the rising action. We talked about the climax. In this case, I struggle as a human being, as a teacher, as a reader, as a person. I struggle with what is the falling action? What is the falling action? And in this case, I don't see any. I don't see an example of it other than it is the beating of his hideous heart. That's sort of the part of the climax. And then it stops. And that last period, quote or exclamation point, quotation, there is your falling action.
So technically it's like a cliffhanger because we don't know what happens to him.
But I will say this. How about this, Miss Thompson? And this is the mind-blowing part. The resolution is the first paragraph. The resolution, as a reader, we see he's telling us how he did it. He's relaying to us. So now he's somewhere else. We don't know where he is. I can assume that he's maybe in prison at this point, or somebody mentioned the crazy guy killing someone else. I forget if that was CW or CS. But whoever that was, maybe he's in an institution where he's being monitored. And he's talking to someone, a reader, and he's telling us. And this is very high-level stuff in the fact that it's sort of fit for 8th graders because we can think about this. He says, true. The very first 8 lines. True, nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? Who is saying that he's mad? AW! AW, you have asked a fantastic question. If you're not privy to the chat, because you don't have it pulled up, AW has asked a question. Maybe this is all made up because he's insane. And can
was dead the whole time.
Yes. So AW, I'm going to build off that before I go back to the resolution. I'm going to build off the question that you asked. So AW has asked a question in the chat. It says, maybe this is all made up. So my question to you, AW, and the rest of the class, this is a fair question to ask. How much credibility does the narrator have in relaying the story? In what way can we gain credibility? And if we go back to that first paragraph, he says, why will you then say I'm mad? Now, I've never accused him of being mad. I doubt you've accused him of being mad, but somebody has. It could be a person. It could be the voices in his head. We have no idea. So he could be living through all of this in his brain. We have no idea. And then it says, the disease has sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in heaven and in earth. I heard all things in hell. How then am I mad? Can I tell you what that must be like? Now, as living as Mr. Neiman, I can tell you that if you got exposed to what's in my brain, you would want out in the first 30 seconds. Trust me, you would want out.
But I'm picturing a lot of circus music.
Yes, 100%. But if I could hear everything in heaven, everything on earth, and everything in hell all at once, at one moment, I think I would be driven mad. I think I would be driven mad. And his point is, this is what its life is like. So he goes through this story about how he killed someone. AW, that is a great observation. That is a fantastic observation, actually. How much credibility can the author have in this case? Or I'm sorry, not the author, but the narrator. How much credibility does the narrator have in this entire story? That is a great question. So now we're going to head back to the resolution phase. The resolution is the end of the story. And I believe this first paragraph is the resolution. But you don't realize it's the resolution because you haven't gone through the entire story. Once you get to the end of the story, then you can come back and realize that first 8 sentences or first 8 lines is actually him outside of the story and retelling the story from the vantage point of beyond the story. So you go to a party or you watch a play on football Friday night, and then you come back and you retell that story. That is part of the resolution. Guys, this is a whole lot easier in person because you can draw a timeline. But I'm telling you that this story is very complex. And Ms. Thompson has added something. He also could have attacked the police and escaped, and now he's on the run. Man on the run. This is madness. What a great story. Man on the run. So what we have here is a situation in which AW has asked a question and is opened a can of worms. Ms. Thompson says, what if he actually killed the police and he's on the run now, telling this story to anyone who will listen? That is part of this. AW asks, is he credible? Well, I ask you, is he credible? That's a great question. And as we go through this, you've got to recognize the plot diagram pieces and other pieces. This guy is repeating words. Why is he repeating words? What does repeating words have anything to do with anything? Well, it could add suspense. That's another
I
problem.
like how the recording of Christopher Lee reading it, some of the lines were done in an echo effect, almost implying that it was inside his head.
Ooh, that is a very good point. When he does the reading, he adds elements to it that sort of help us, the reader, understand. And the echoey part of louder, 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 and then it cuts off. I think I would agree with you, Ms. Thompson. That's great. And so AW still maintains that he's mad. AW, I'm going to ask a question for you and you only. Why do you say he's mad? Because he has gone to great lengths to tell us that he's not mad. And I can give those examples, but you say he is. I would love to know what evidence do you have from the story that he is mad? Not mad in the sense that he's angry, but mad in the sense that he's a few fries short of a Happy Meal. Insane, if you will. Do you have any remembrances in the story that makes him mad? I think CS, you're on to something. That is the clearest example. So your point is that only insane people think that it's the insane that think they're sane. So no one insane thinks they're insane. And that's a true statement. People who are insane usually say, I'm not crazy. I'm not mad. I'm normal. You're the ones who are crazy. He keeps saying he's mad. No one insane says, hey, he kills someone because of their eye. That's true. So he is driven to great passion. So much passion that he ends up killing the man because of that eye. It does something to him. He obsesses about it so much that it takes over his life. And there's a lesson to be learned here, I think. What do we allow in our lives to make us obsess so much? I see it as an 8th grade teacher. Kids, come in, they're all fired up and somebody said something about me. Like, they may have, you're right. But you cannot live the next 24 hours of your life obsessing about that one thing that they said about you. You just can't do it. Otherwise, it'll drive you mad. The lesson is wear an eye patch. Yes. I don't know if that's the lesson, but I can honestly say there have been some great conversations. And here's what's going to happen. I'm going to ask you, in light of what we just talked about today, and we talked about a few things. Number one, plot diagram, exposition phase, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. I'm going to ask that you reread the story one more time and come back with a clear understanding of those 5 pieces as we just talked about them. I'm also going to ask you to try to find textual evidence as to what makes the narrator either crazy or not crazy, or in this case, we're all agreeing that he is sort of a little loose in the screws up there. He has some screws loose. What is some examples from the text? Not just that he's crazy or he killed a person, but you tell me the lines. You tell me the lines that you find. And you can just write that on a notebook paper. And that is sort of what we're looking for when we come back for Thursday's class. Remember, no class this Friday. No class. There is no class this Friday. It's not that I assign you something and you work on it on your own Friday. That's not true. It's not that you show up to the Zoom session. That's not true. There is 0 work for this Friday. There's 0 anything for this Friday. So really Thursday is the day that we're going to talk about some things. I'm going to give you an assignment and you're going to do that assignment. I think it's 10 or 12 questions again on Google Forms. So that's what we're looking at. So here's what I need. I need you to go through and try to locate those 5, really have a good grasp of those 5 elements of plot diagram. Remember, it's exposition where we learn about things. It's rising action that leads to the climax. And then it's the falling action finished with the resolution. I want you to have a good grasp of those for this story. And I also want you to find some textual evidence that, if you can, of what makes you think this guy is mad. You have to give me like a line number. You have to give yourself a line number. So simple stuff. It's not going to be graded, but it will help you for the assignment on Thursday. So if you have any questions, please stick around. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Stop share. And if you have any questions, you can stick around. But that was 30 minutes. I'm going to stop it.